Welcome to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining us tonight is Shirley Ginwright. She is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, Shirley.
Good afternoon, Cassie. Good evening, rather. And thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, we were talking before the show about the fact that I've interviewed you on Your Need to Know in 2018. I've interviewed you on Inside Scoop in 2019, right before the commemoration at Jamestown. And here we are on Making Change Radio, again, talking about your role in helping our community here in Fairfax and in the Commonwealth of Virginia to grapple with some of these major issues around racism, around the disadvantage that many of our communities of color have economically, educationally, in health, and in housing. So I do want to mention right up front that you are part of the African American Advisory Board advising the Governor of Virginia on these issues. So with that in place, let's talk about what people are seeing and hearing around the country about riots. You know, do you think people understand that what we should be talking about isn't a symptom, which to me the riots are a symptom, but rather the larger issue of racism, which we have not sufficiently addressed in this country?
I think both of them need to be discussed, but racism is at the top of the list. Like Dr. King had said, the voice of the unheard is heard through riots, not direct quote. And that's what we're seeing now. People who have been oppressed, who have been trying to get their voices heard, don't know where to turn. And as a result, we are seeing the riots and the destruction of communities.
And do you think that people don't understand that, you know, we had the Civil War, we had the Civil Rights Movement, there were riots after Rodney King, there have been riots after police shootings around the country, and people, and white people seem not to understand where the rage is coming from.
And I don't think it's that they don't understand. I don't think they want to understand. And that's because of the racism, you know, it's not happening to me.
Right.
So therefore, it isn't
Where's the
a
urgency?
problem.
What's the urgency if it doesn't touch my life?
Exactly. And then when something like this happens, where you have the riot and a store is being burned, but that store belongs to a white person, now all of a sudden, there's a big issue with this. But they still don't want to listen at the bottom line of which is blacks are disproportionately being incarcerated. Even with the COVID-19, there's a disproportionality in the death rates. There's a disproportionality in the education of blacks and the economic conditions. And all of those are underlying elements to what's going on today with the riots. And the use of force by police, that definitely hasn't been addressed around the country.
I mean, you know, I go back to Trayvon Martin and think, you know, that was a clarion call. And that was before Michael Brown and Ferguson. It was before Philandro Castillo, right there in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. Like, this is not the first time this has happened in Minneapolis. And so why as a culture, as a country, we can't understand the frustration of these issues not being addressed, but particularly the excessive use of force by law enforcement.
And then you would think that, and using Minneapolis or Missouri as an example, that their police policies should have been reviewed long time ago to correct some of the behaviors, because it's the training and the behaviors. And after you've done something so long, it becomes a part of your culture. And you expect that to happen. And if there's no one trying to make a change, then you say, okay, it's okay. We've been doing this. So why should we change?
And it's not just, the excessive use of force, and believe me, people can rattle off the names of the unarmed black people, mostly black men, who have been gunned down where the officers walked away without charges, without any accountability whatsoever.
Exactly.
But down in Brunswick, Georgia, it's even more perplexing. The murder of Ahmaud Arbery by vigilantes, and it took a national outcry and over 2 months for the police in Brunswick, Georgia, to arrest the two men who shot that unarmed young man while he was running, and it was videotaped by somebody else. And that's the other thing that blows my mind. We have videotape now, which you would think would make a difference when you can see with your own eyes what is happening, and yet what it's shown us is that it has made almost no difference whatsoever.
Right. And see, in Georgia, with Ahmaud's killing, if that tape, if the third-party person had not submitted that tape, they would have gotten off.
They would have. There's no question they would have. So what does that say about law enforcement in Brunswick, Georgia? And to me, what does it say about the community? You think about the faith leaders in communities like that, and you wonder, where are the ordinary citizens? Why does it take a national outcry for justice to happen in a place like Brunswick?
Right. But look at the connections between the law enforcement. This guy was a former police officer.
Yes.
He had connection as an investigator with the prosecutors. You had two prosecutors who recourse themselves and say, "Hold it, I'm not going to do this. I can't because he's a friend of mine." But for 2 months, you knew you had this video, and I think they should be prosecuted as well.
The lack of accountability, to me, is what I think a lot of people are missing in all of this. It's like insult added to the injury. When you know an injustice has been done, and people who have the power to hold those accountable refuse to do so.
Exactly. And it's the same thing going on in Minneapolis now.
Yep.
There were 4 officers involved. One of them was arrested about a week later, and now you have 3 others that are still out there. They're still at home, but they were just as guilty.
Right, and this community saw the officers in the Philando Castillo case walk away.
Yes.
And so that that kind of the trust that should exist between any citizen in any community and law enforcement as people who are there to aid in the system has been eroded.
Exactly. And there is no trust there. The people there don't expect the police department to do anything. The police department is working on archaic policies. There is no connection with the community at all. Even though you have a black police chief, you still have to ask yourself, what is he doing? You have an officer who had killed someone who had 18 complaints against him. All of them were dismissed except for 2, but he's still a police officer.
Right. And it's interesting when you say that you have a black police chief, and let's talk about that in the whole scope of how people look at the topic of racism. So, a friend of mine was saying that they hoped, electing Barack Obama and the fact that we now have, here in Virginia, we have an African-American lieutenant governor, and we have 2 congressional representatives, Don McEachin, Bobby Scott, that, these are the people who hopefully are going to solve this problem. And it kind of blows my mind that people don't understand that assuming that black people can solve a problem created and perpetuated by white people is kind of a jump.
Yeah, it is. But going back to the police chief, he can make changes by reviewing those policies. He can do that. And for some reason that wasn't done. He could have looked at the record of this individual who had 18 complaints against him and say, you're not the type of person that I want on my police force. He could look at the training that his police officers have. So I guarantee you that these 4 aren't the only ones who have done something like this. They're running rapid. It just so happened that this was caught on tape. But just think how much has been done before the cell phones came out.
Right, before everybody had a camera in their pocket.
Yes. And remember when citizens first started recording police officers, there was a big cry, well, you can't record us. They didn't want to be recorded.
Right. And now they have body cameras, and half the time you find out that the dash cam or the body cam mysteriously wasn't turned on.
Exactly. So and I think that should be a violation.
So even having the tools does not guarantee that you actually, the people operating them are going to operate them in good faith.
Mm-hmm. Right. And here in Fairfax, I remember I was on the group that worked on the body camera policy for Fairfax. And that was a huge discussion as to when you turn your body camera off.
Right. So for those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and we are talking with Shirley Ginwright. She is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. And this is a citizen organization whose focus is on strengthening and building positive relationships between public safety agencies and the communities they serve here in Fairfax County. So when talking about the fact that we've got technology that clearly is supposed to hold people accountable, and yet we have seen no demonstrable impact that these tools and these videos are actually doing that. Again, this is sort of feeding this rage that at this point has simply boiled over. Do you see a way, back from this, especially when you've got a president like Donald Trump basically inciting governors, which he did on Monday in a video conference, inciting governors to use force and to lock people up?
And I think only thing that is going to do with the kids of today, the protesters you have today, which are different from the protesters during the civil rights movement, they are not going to back down. Because what Donald Trump is doing now is what he did when he was running for president. He reached out to his base. Remember once he told the police officers, oh, don't be nice to them when you're arresting them. Bump their heads.
Yeah, I remember that.
Okay. So some of your police officers, saying, okay, the president of the United States said we could do that, so we'll be able to do it and get away with it.
It's just remarkable that the president of the United States, well, everything about it is unbelievable, but the fact that he is using his office to basically incite further violence.
And he is doing that, and you have, like when I was growing up, we had the Black Panthers. And of course, they were not a violent group. They did a lot of great things, but the government tried to make it seem as if, oh, well, wow, they're doing this and they're doing that, which they were not. They were helping the community more, which the government did not want to recognize. But now you have the groups, the Black Lives Matter, young people who are saying, we've had enough. We are not going to be 60 years old and going through the same thing that I, who's past 60, went through when I was younger. We're going to put a stop to it. And I see with the riots and things that are going on now and how this has spread across the country and even other countries are protesting.
Yes, I saw
Black
in London.
Lives Matter. Yes.
Yeah, in London. And
yes.
I saw the photos that were published in the Roanoke Times on Monday. Amazing photojournalism of the protest there in Roanoke. And to me, and it was a peaceful protest. There weren't the riots that you saw in Richmond going on 3 days, where those Confederate monuments were spray painted, where protesters did in fact, and here's the other thing. Let's just back up 2 seconds to talk about protesters versus looters and the fact that we're sort of conflating them to be one and the same, which
And
is
they're not.
making which is making an assumption that is not true or proven, that the
Right.
people who came out to protest are the ones looting.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
I
they
think
are not.
we need to step back and look at, we're talking about two different issues.
Right. I was talking this morning to, I had to call Verizon, and the representative that I got was in Philadelphia. I'm sorry, in Pittsburgh. But he was saying that last night there was a van of young people who got out of the van, a whole slew of them, but they were not part of the protest, but they became part of the looting.
Uh-huh.
And that's what you'll find, because I know in Minnesota they were saying that a lot of those who have been arrested are not from that area. And
they're
you
from
will
out of
see,
state.
That's exactly right. And you will see that. They will come in and they will incite the riots and the destruction and have people destroy the neighborhoods, and then they'll go back to wherever they came from and look for the next opportunity.
And I do think it's impacting the potency of the protest, because so many people are so ready to dismiss the protesters because they see them as these agents of violence, and it's easier to just shut down the reason for the protest by dismissing them as being a criminal element. But isn't that the whole story that underlies the most dangerous aspect of racism in this country to begin with?
But when they're talking about the criminals, if you look at the protests and even the riots, there are just as many whites out there as there are blacks.
Yeah.
But they're looking at, the criminals are the black ones.
Yeah.
And,
and that brings up the whole issue of what happened in Central Park. So many people have said it was just a confluence of so many things that ignited all of this. It was George Floyd, being murdered by a policeman who was captured on videotape doing it. It was a Harvard graduate in Central Park who was accused of threatening some woman's life because he asked her to put her dog on a leash. It's just insult on top of injury, on top of a pandemic that has already hit hard communities of color, because communities of color already have problems with health and housing and, the jobs that force them out into the public, not working from home. All of this sort of, it was just this conflagration of a lot of bad things that happened all at once.
Right. And going back to Central Park, this woman knew exactly what she was doing, because her first statement was, I'm going to call the police and tell them this black African American is threatening me. And then when she got on the phone with the police, she escalated her voice like she was actually in danger. Had he not recorded that, and had the police came out there, he could have been the next statistic.
Exactly.
Because that's exactly what she was doing. Oh my God, I'm being threatened by this African American male, because she knew exactly what has happened in the past when African American men have been accused of something when it was related to a white woman.
And there's so much history there, Shirley, and we don't teach that in school, by the way. If you ask people if they knew what the book The Klansman is, written by Thomas Dixon, how it inspired Birth of a Nation, which was the first film ever shown in the White House, and what that storyline is, and how ingrained and embedded that bias is against black men, people have not been taught that in school. And it's a huge part of our culture. And it's a huge underlying cause of racism today in 2020.
And they won't teach it in school, because I say the books that we're using in school don't have a lot of input from African American writers and authors.
It's true.
So you're looking at one side, the side of the person who wrote it, and they want you to hear and learn exactly what their thought process is. When we were doing the change of name in Fairfax from Jeb Stewart, which is now Justice High School. Constantly we heard, well, you're trying to change history. You want to rewrite history. No, we want history to be told exactly as it happened. Tell the truth about the history.
You are so right about that. And for those of you who have just joined us, this is Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining us tonight is Shirley Ginwright, who is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. You also are on the Governor's African American Advisory Board, and you are the former chair of Fairfax County's NAACP. I would also add that this isn't your first time at the rodeo.
No.
You go all the way back to the Civil Rights Movement. And when I think about how, in the aftermath of Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, how U Street in D.C. was decimated in the aftermath of that, and you're thinking, and here we are again. What's happening in Richmond to me is like so much of what happened, but in the intervening years, in all these intervening years, after the glass gets cleaned up, what has changed?
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. And that's what the discussion is. What do we need to make the change? Our criminal justice system must be changed. And we see legislators that are elected year after year, and they do nothing. They do nothing. They forget that they work for us. We're the ones who elected them into those positions. So we talk about voting. You need to make sure you vote, Democratic or Republican. I don't care. My thing is you vote for the person that has the best interest of your issues, who address those issues. If you have someone that has been elected and they forgot that they work for you, guess what? Vote them out. That's not a permanent job for them. Go down to their office and remind them why they were elected for that position. Hold them accountable, your legislators, the same way we want to hold our police departments accountable.
You bring up
Both of them need to be accountable.
You bring up something really important here too, which is President Barack Obama on Monday issued a statement on Medium.com about the protests, where he spoke about the need to organize and the justification for protests. However, he, like John Lewis, promoted the idea that the protests can be peaceful and should be.
Correct.
But he also said you have to vote. And so many young people are out of patience, not seeing that it's a marathon, not a sprint. And it feels better to take action. And I understand that. It feels better to get out and show your anger, to organize and to show how many people have had enough of this. But without going to the ballot box at your local level, at your state level, during federal elections, you can't put people into place who are going to make the policies that change both the laws and how we hold those who execute the laws accountable when they violate them.
You're right. And I was saying, I had a discussion this morning, and I was saying it's too bad that with COVID-19, had it not been in existence, that we couldn't have voter registration forms and go out with a demonstration. Say, hey, look, are you registered?
Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
Registration. But
voter
we have to also talk, and to me, as a part of the discussions when we're having these protests, if they have speakers, not just tell them to go out and vote, but you might need to have like a 10-minute education on the impact of voting in your local elections.
Right.
And a lot of people don't show up when it comes to the local elections. Some of your prosecutors are elected into office.
That's correct. Your prosecutors, your sheriffs, and when you talk about the Board of Supervisors, and here in Fairfax County, I will point out that Fairfax County took an interest in this idea that you had back in 2014, that in order to avoid a lot of what has happened in places like Ferguson, Missouri, which was the genesis, that you have to be proactive. Like, you have to figure out how to build relationships. And
Exactly.
Chairman Sharon Bulova was open to that. And again, the Board of Supervisors, you have a police chief that you have a great relationship with, but voting matters. And if people don't get out and vote for their Board of Supervisors, if they don't know who their sheriff is, if they don't understand what a Commonwealth attorney does, then they're missing it, because this is the greatest impact in a community.
Yes. And like we here in Fairfax now, we have Steve Descano is our new Commonwealth attorney. And I remember when Steve was running, I heard a lot of conversations about, well, he's new and he hasn't been there before and he hasn't done this and he hasn't done that. Well, I said our former attorney general, Commonwealth attorney, did not have experience when he was elected into that position. And like I said, those positions aren't there for your lifetime. You're not supposed to retire from these positions.
Right.
And if you're not doing what you're supposed to do or what the people think you're supposed to do, then you need to be voted out. And that's what happened here in Fairfax. Steve ran on criminal justice reform. That's what the people were interested in, changing the system that we have seen for so many years that was not working, and especially for people of color.
I remember those forums, and the fact that some of the criticism against Steve was that he was trying to legislate from that office, and that was not what the job was. But interestingly enough, when the elections came around that put Steve Descano in as Commonwealth attorney, it also flipped the state Senate, and we took control of the House of Delegates in our state legislature. And suddenly, Steve does not have to legislate from that position, because we elected people in Richmond who are passing laws that will support what his vision is for criminal justice reform.
Right, exactly. And then one of the things, still talking about Steve, that in a private conversation with him, one of the things that he had wanted to do, and this was before he was elected, was to engage other Commonwealth attorneys to talk about issues and what they could do to help make changes.
And I think that is critically important, to have a consistency from one county to another county. And when we come back from our break, we're going to discuss this further. So please don't go away. After this break, we'll be talking with Shirley Ginwright, who is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust.
Radio Fairfax, the go-to station for a truly unique and rewarding listening experience. Made by producers who want to share their love of music, talk, or ideas with you. Free of commercial corporate radio control. Radio Fairfax, your voice, your station.
Colombia Espacion is a program that features great Latin music, including salsa, cumbia, and vallenato, amongst all Latin music genres. There'll be guest artists, live interviews, and sports segments. So tune in every Sunday at 9 a.m. and be a part of the Latin American community here on Radio Fairfax.
FM Odyssey is astonishing audiences with its freestyle fusion of legendary and contemporary rock artists, as well as interviews with talented musicians. FM Odyssey, Saturday morning at 7 on Radio Fairfax.
Get involved. We have courses in radio and television production, post-production, and much more.
Here's your chance to put your voice and talent to use.
What are you waiting for? Your show could be the next big hit.
Pick up the phone and call us at 571-749-1102 or visit our website, www.fcac.org/orientation.
Welcome back to Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and joining me tonight is Shirley Ginwright, the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. She is also on the governor's African American Advisory Board and the former president of Fairfax County's NAACP. So when we went to break, Shirley, you were talking about the fact that we have a new Commonwealth attorney in Fairfax who has a much broader vision for not just reforming Fairfax County, but working across jurisdictional lines to have a vision of criminal justice reform be embraced by other Commonwealth attorneys as well. Do you see this as an important part of the blueprint when we talk about criminal justice reform?
Most definitely, because now it gives a forum to find out what some of the other issues are. And I think Fairfax is, and some of the things we do are a lot more progressive than other areas. So this is extremely important to say, this is what we're doing here. These are some of the problems you might have, but look at what we're doing. Can you use this? You know, basically the best practices, and how can these best practices help you in what you're doing?
So I'm going to just jump here for a minute, because something you said reminded me of the work that the communities of trust are doing in the schools. And the fact that you're trying to build different relationships between law enforcement, specifically school resource officers, SROs, and children in our public schools, because this is actually where it starts, with criminalizing children of color who are disproportionately represented in the juvenile justice system. And this is where it starts. And I have seen some discussion in these protests that are happening around the country that people want to see school resource officers eliminated or their role dramatically changed. And I think it's very interesting that this is bubbling up right now. You know, how do you see going forward how to address that particular charge that the criminalization that is racially motivated is actually happening to the youngest children in public school systems across the country?
And that has to also be addressed through the policies that the school systems have. And again, I'm going back and use Fairfax because, you know, we have a memorandum of understanding between the Fairfax County Public Schools and our police department. So I led a committee to actually review that memorandum of understanding, and there was like 16 different organizations that participated on that. And we looked at it to find out what were the roles and responsibilities of the school resource officers. And the biggest issue was the SROs were being used in disciplinary issues, administrative issues, which they had nothing to do with. So when we rewrote our policy, we made very clear the distinction between the administrators of the schools and the school resource officers. And since that time, this is just one piece of it, we have seen changes, but there's also very good relationships between some of the students and their school resource officers. The other piece of that...
And that varies, but it varies by school, right? This comes back to consistency in that if you have one particular... And this is, you know, every school has its own culture, and that a lot of times is driven by the school principal. Right. So given the huge number of schools, Fairfax County is the 10th largest school system in the nation, considering how it can vary from one school to another, where you've got a school resource officer who's seen as a very positive influence, who the children embrace and trust, and then go to another school where it's not. Where's the answer in trying to put together some consistency?
Well, again, that consistency was with the policy change, because when you had a school resource officer being called in for disciplinary issues because somebody kicked a garbage can, you know, that's what the kids look at it as. Yeah. So now there's a different role, and we actually see some of the students have said, well, I really like our school resource officer because I can go talk to them about even personal issues that they wouldn't talk to someone else about. And then we'll find some of our SROs in Fairfax have been in those positions for a while. So they have very personal relationships with the students.
And I think we're very fortunate in Fairfax County to prioritize education. It's the biggest budget item in the county's budget is for education in Fairfax County. We've also done some pretty innovative things like with the SCIPT program, Successful Children and Youth Policy Team. The SCIPT program has also been the place where they've looked into restorative justice programs.
Right. Yes.
We actually have restorative justice specialists on staff in Fairfax County. So in that regard, I think Fairfax is a good place to look.
Right.
Where best practices have been in place for a while, trying to turn this ship.
Okay, and let's talk briefly about the restorative justice program in the schools. When I was the president of the Fairfax County NAACP, there was a lot of disparity, and the kids being suspended or expelled. And one of the things that I did, I met with the police chief, I met with the juvenile justice, Mr. Birmingham. I met with other people from the school system, and we just sat down and we discussed the issue. And one of the statements that was made was, well, we've been looking for people to help us, so if we don't know who to bring around the table. And I stopped him. I said, okay, look at me. Bring me around the table. So let's discuss this. But what we have now is in Fairfax County, the restorative justice program. So instead of expelling a child or suspending them for something that is not criminal, now you have a group where you can go discuss that behavior. And then you come up with an agreement. You did this. How did it impact your victim? And what do you need to do for restitution to correct this? The Fairfax County Police Department has a policy that they are required, when it comes to the youth, to say why that child did not or was not recommended to participate in the restorative justice program. Number one, you cannot participate in if you've already gone through it before. But that puts the extra burden on our police officers. Now that eliminates another step in putting them into the criminal justice system. So it has worked in Fairfax. It will work in other jurisdictions. And I have had a conversation with Secretary Moran about it, and I briefly had a conversation with Governor Northam about it. And as a member of the African American Advisory Board, this is one of the recommendations that I have recommended to our subcommittee, and that's the Subcommittee on Public Safety and Criminal Justice, as one of the recommendations to Governor Northam, that this should be a program, some type of restorative justice or restorative alternative across the state. Now, there was a bill that was introduced this year on restorative alternative that did not get passed, but it's going to be introduced again next year. And now I have Paul Krisak, I spoke with him yesterday evening, who had said that he will help support that bill.
That gives me a lot of hope to think that Virginia is serious about addressing this in the public school system, which to me is where it all starts. Cultural bias starts. The history that is not accurately portrayed is taught to students in our school system. And so the commitment is amazing to me. And so for those of you who are just joining us, this is Making Change Radio here on Radio Fairfax. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and the change maker we are talking to tonight is Shirley Ginwright, who is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. And so the idea of restorative justice, and a lot of people are not familiar with it, but it's worth, Google it if nothing else, so that you can understand what this process is about. First of all, we want to step away from criminalizing childhood. And this was one of the charges made about student resource officers in the school systems basically escalating somebody kicking a trash can to a case that ends up in court. The fact that it's disproportionately not just children of color, but those with disabilities such as autism. We're ending up in the criminal justice system.
Correct.
Over behavior that is pretty typical childhood behavior. And so the thing about restorative justice that I find very interesting is that not only does it hold accountable the person who harmed someone else and forces them to make restitution of some kind, but it gives the perpetrator a way to be made whole again. Yes. And keep in mind, we're talking about children. Yes. Children. So when a child harms another child, there has to be a way back for both of them. There has to be accountability, but we have to make these children whole, because you don't want broken children simply being processed through greater and greater systems where they are subjected to punitive accountability where it's not appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Now, the one thing with the restorative justice program, that's mostly in the high school area, but we have a lot of kids, even in kindergarten, that are being suspended because of behavior. And my first thought was, what adult can handle a kindergartner? But we also have to look at the mental issue and the economic issue. Find out what's going on in that child's household, that behavior is this way.
And you bring up something important. This has been another charge that I have heard for years and years and years, and that is there's not enough guidance counselors in the school system. The guidance counselors that are there don't have time to substantively help children who have serious issues. And there's always funding for SROs, make sure every school has an SRO, but where are the mental health professionals and the people who should be in those school systems addressing what you have just pointed out are the root causes of them acting out?
Yeah. And one of the things, again, I like talking to my legislators when I come up with an idea. So I'm not going to call out which legislator I talked to about that, but I suggested to him that for all of our psychiatrists or psychologists or whoever that is retiring, then maybe we give them a tax break by bringing them back to do some part-time work in the schools, because they might not need additional funding because it's going to put them in a higher tax bracket. So basically they're giving away free, but give them some type of incentive to come back.
That is brilliant, Shirley, and I mean that sincerely, because there are school systems, such as, and the one that leaps to mind is the Lynchburg city school system, where the retiring police officers were being hired back as SROs.
Yes. Well, not in Fairfax.
Not in Fairfax, but this was in Lynchburg. But you've got a point about why not take people who are retired and who want to do that kind of mental health work with children particularly, and put them in our public school systems where they are so desperately needed.
Yes.
That's brilliant.
So that was a bill that I had asked someone to put in. They didn't do it for 2 years, Paul.
But we love Paul. And here's the thing.
We do. That's why I'm calling them out.
So here's the thing, too, I would say, because we have flipped both the House and the Senate, barely in the Senate, in 2019, there was 23 years of pent-up demand for good legislation to be passed that had been held up by the GOP majority for all those years. Right. And so not every bill got passed this year for two reasons, because it would be impossible to catch up on 25 years worth of needed legislation in one legislative session. But it also has to be funded, and people don't always understand that good legislation requires resources. And so, there were things actually passed in this legislative session that are being delayed because of the pandemic's impact on our economy. And the fact that our economy is simply not going to generate the expected tax revenues to fund all of the legislation that was passed. But that being said, people need to keep their eye on the ball. Again, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yes.
And let's talk a little bit about the fact that you, with the Communities of Trust, are all about doing community outreach, finding people who want to sit at the table and be public citizen advisors for developing good public policy.
Well, as you know, the Community Trust Committee was established in 2014 after Ferguson. And right now, this is our 6th year.
Yeah, 6 years.
6 years ago. And the organization, the committee rather, has grown tremendously. And I tell people, I think part of our success has been the fact that every one of our meetings begins with prayer. I always put God or whoever you're serving first. And we don't have the conflicts. Everything is done by agreement around the table. It is not my committee. It's our committee. And the thing is, we have, like, some of our members from the FBI. We have Apple Federal Credit Union. We have the Department of Justice around the table. We have the Voices of Vietnam. And we have faith groups, Jewish community, Muslim community. All of these are around the table, and we discuss issues. Like last week, our issue was the swastika that was sprayed on in one of the communities in Reston. So what are we going to do about that? We had the discussion and decided that we needed to have a town hall again around hate crimes. And then, of course, the death of George Floyd happened. So now we will expand this town hall to include hate crimes and racial issues, racism. And so I'm working on that now. But that was a decision that was made by this entire committee. And then this committee also has input on what should be discussed. This isn't decided by me. You know, they'll come out and say, okay, here's some of the questions. Here's some of the issues that we need to discuss. And, of course, everybody is just outraged about what happened with the swastikas. We've not met since the death of George Floyd. But, okay,
well,
go ahead.
But you make an important point about the fact that the whole point of having a committee is to have many different viewpoints represented around the table, so that it's not top down. It's that you have decision makers who have the ability to impact public policy, sitting down with people who represent specific communities, saying this is what our issues are, this is the challenge that we have, this is the problem we're experiencing, and what can we collectively come up with that's a better solution than what we have now.
And we really wanted to, when initially our big focus was on working with the kids. And so we have had several what we call public safety days, and I call it the mini carnival for the kids in different underserved communities. Now we have Learners Corporation, and you know, Learners are the owners of the NAACP.
Oh, wow.
So they are also around the table as a member of the Communities of Trust Committee. We have Fox 5 that joined a couple of months ago.
Wow.
That's
an impressive roster, Shirley. A very impressive roster.
It keeps growing. It keeps growing.
Well, for those of you who are just joining us, you're listening to Shirley Ginwright, who is the chair of Fairfax County's Communities of Trust. You're listening to Making Change Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. And in light of the unrest that has overtaken the country in the last week, we are discussing ways in which, you know, especially on a local level, people can take action in a way that is productive, in a way that is positive, and in a way that will lead to long-lasting change. Because we've all seen this played out previously, whether it's Rodney King, whether it was the riots after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, whether it was the riots after Ferguson, Missouri. We don't want to keep replaying the same scenario over and over again. There has to be a path toward lasting change. And that is what we are exploring today.
So let me mention something else that a recommendation that I had. Within our police departments, an officer can be fired from one jurisdiction and will go to another, work as a police officer. There is not a national nor a state database that tracks this. And at a state level, and this is something, again, that I'm recommending, hopefully be pushed up to the governors for recommendations, is that we have a state database that say any officer that is fired from Prince William County or Fairfax or wherever cannot work in a law enforcement position in the state of Virginia, and the fact that their certification is revoked by the Department of Criminal Justice Service, and that this database is opened to all of the other states in the United States, and that the reporting is mandatory. So if you have a smaller jurisdiction, say, okay, well, we don't have the staff to report this. Oh, yeah, you do. But also, if a person, an officer, knows that they're getting ready to get fired and they decide to resign, that form should still be filled out and sent to the Department of Criminal Justice Service with the annotation that they resigned prior to being released.
That would be so huge, Shirley. That would be so huge. That's like a doctor who loses his license in one state to practice medicine, going next door to another state and being able to practice medicine.
Yes. And that's what's happening in Missouri. You know, they go right across, they go 2 miles to the next county and get hired again.
This would be huge. Is this something, you know, here's the thing about our form of government. You know, there are powers that the federal government holds for themselves, and then there are powers that are given to the states. Mm-hmm. And so a national database like this and getting every state to participate, under what purview? Is that something that the Federal Department of Justice would set up and mandate?
I'm not sure, but I think we can talk to Jerry Connolly about that.
Well, you know,
see what ideas he has.
I know, but you know, it does all start with ideas, and you know something, no one has cornered the market on ideas, and that's one of the things that I hope our listeners understand, that you don't have to be an expert to have a great idea. You just have to have experienced something that tells you that the system is broken in some way.
Yeah, and if they don't know who to talk to, they can always send a message to Communities of Trust.
Yeah, and that's it. It's a citizen organization, and that's what people need to understand, that if you live in a community, then you are qualified to have an opinion.
Yes, yes. And there's no wrong opinion, no bad suggestions.
That's right. But if we don't get feedback from communities, then what ends up happening is people at the top of the food chain make laws and policies without ever knowing who you are, without ever having been to your neighborhood, without knowing your families, without having stepped inside your place of worship or the public schools. And that's not a good place to make policy from.
Right, and you're going to have to follow them. And just like one of the policies that was changed this year was the decriminalization of marijuana. Yeah. And this is something Senator Adam Evans has fought for a long time. And I went down to Richmond several times to defend the bill, and it got defeated every time. We got it passed this year, thank goodness. But that also was having an extremely negative impact on people of color. And some of our students were getting arrested and stopped with annotation, well, we thought we smelt marijuana in your car, or there was residue of marijuana in your ashtray. It was never tested, so it was just the police officer's opinion. But at the same time, you might have had a student who was in school under a Pell Grant. Well, this student could not allow a charge to be placed against him that was related to drugs because now it automatically eliminated him or her from getting any type of government assistance for housing, education, food, whatever.
Right. Those TANF
So that
bills.
was huge. Yes, that was very huge.
Well, and so this brings us to another really important point. Besides, getting out to protest to let people know that this is intolerable, to point out injustice where you see it, to make it real for people. You have to get out and vote, not just for president. You have to vote for school board and supervisor and Commonwealth attorney and sheriff.
Yeah.
This is important. The other thing is you have to participate, and whether that's joining a citizens group like Communities of Trust or being part of our legislative process in Richmond. And I bring this up because next year in 2021, which, by the way, is an election year for governor next year, we also have a 45-day legislative session, 45 working days, and that includes weekends, to listen to thousands of bills. And so if you've got an idea for a way to improve or create a policy or a process or an organization or an agency, the time to reach out to your state senator or your state delegate is now. Because by the time it comes to the fall of the year, your good idea in January will have to wait a year. Your good idea needs to start right now. Find out who represents you in the state legislature. Email them, call them, tell them your thoughts. Ask them to carry a bill. And this is what you've been talking about. Carry a bill for me.
And then one of the things that I try to tell people too is that our legislators or your legislators are home now. Get in their face. Let them know who you are. Don't just go talk to them one time.
Have a relationship with him.
That's exactly right.
Build a relationship. Well, something, that is a great parting thought, Shirley. I can't thank you enough for your time tonight. This has been such an important discussion to have, and I hope we've left our listeners with a feeling like there's a path forward and a way for them to do something that will make a difference in the future.
Well, I certainly hope so. And again, thank you so much for having me on your shows. I appreciate it, and I hope that I have been able to embark some type of education, knowledge to the listeners.
Well,
I welcome them to come around the table of Communities of Trust and be a part of the resolution to what our issues are here in Fairfax County, the state, and hopefully around the country.
Thank you so much, Shirley. And for those of you listening, this has been Making Change Radio on Radio Fairfax every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Join us next week.